Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start by congratulating the Honourable Gentleman on introducing the bill, which does raise very serious issues. The Honourable Gentleman, I think every time we speak in the Chamber, points out that we don't just share a birthday, we were actually born on the same day. And therefore, probably our taste in... a challenge I happily accept. As a result, we probably have similar tastes in music, not identical, but we grew up during the same era. But where we do agree is that we both share a love of music. Music is tremendously important to me, and it is also tremendously important to this country. It is something we are exceptionally good at and have been for many years. And the importance of the music industry to the UK economy is something that is frequently cited. The Select Committee point out over £5 billion in GVA. We are the second biggest exporter of music in the world. It does enormous amount in terms of global Britain and the projection of our soft power. It is a huge success story. The UK's exports have great potential, but it is worth just flagging that the share of UK music is now beginning to decline. So in 2015 we took 17%, that has now fallen to 10%. That is due to the growth of new markets, particularly Latin America, the developing economies, and also the advent of things like K-pop. I don't know if the Honourable Gentleman is a fan of K-pop. I have to say it slightly passes me by, but I do recognise that it is extremely popular. So he and I have followed the music industry for many years. I should also, he declared his own interest in being a performer and songwriter, who indeed I have heard play many times. I have a son who works in the music industry, who works for Columbia Records, which is part of Sony Music. I've learned a great deal about the economics of the music industry from him, but I have to say my love of music, my involvement in the music industry predate his birth by quite a number of years. The Honourable Gentleman talked about when he first got involved in music industry issues. I have to say I go back rather further. My first involvement was, I think, 35 years ago when I supported the music industry campaign for the introduction of a blank tape levy. Now, I fear there are some people in this chamber who may not even know what a blank tape is, let alone a levy on it. But it dated back to, this is sort of guilty admission time, it dated back to the years when one could sit with a cassette tape recorder waiting for a song to come up on the top 20 and then record it, which was piracy, it was a breach of copyright and to be condemned. And therefore I recognised when I learnt more that this was not to be encouraged, and indeed there should be a levy. And that's something which still is advocated by some in the industry, not as a blank tape levy, but on devices such as iPods or even now smartphones. It was an early example of the threat to the music industry of piracy, but that, of course, increased dramatically with the advent of the internet, and the Honourable Gentleman talked a little bit about the threat which came from illegal downloading, particular peer-to-peer file sharing, and the growth of companies like Pirate Bay and technology like LimeWire. And I can recall taking the Select Committee when I was chair, a little while ago now, to see Lucian Grange. Now, I want to say a word about Lucian Grange, because the Honourable Gentleman didn't name him, but he did refer to him. Lucian Grange is the Chief Executive of Universal Music. He is the person who this year is going to make a huge amount of money. He's doing so because Universal Music have just conducted an IPO very successfully and sold a 10% share, and he, as Chief Executive, is going to profit from that. It is something which I think we should celebrate. Lucian Grange is a British music industry executive who has built Universal Music into the most successful company in the world. And as a Conservative, I have to say that somebody who can celebrate that success as a British citizen, I'm delighted that he is going to do so well as a result, but it is not just him. The whole of his company will do very well, and it is a remarkable success story. Because when we went to see him back in, I think it was about 2008-9, he told us that he was seriously concerned that the industry itself was going to die. That was the extent of the threat to the industry which existed at that time as a result of piracy. And if you look at the earnings of the industry, there was a 15-year decline beginning in the early 2000s in the revenue of the music industry, which was directly attributable to piracy.
Will you give way?
Of course I'll give way.
He mentions Lucian Grange. He may be aware that if an artist in Britain were to produce a song and get 1 million streams, they would receive around £100. So to receive the £153 million Lucian Grange gets, he would need to have 1.5 million streams. Yet Lucian Grange has never produced any music we would ever want to listen to. Whilst he may be a great corporate man making £3 million a week, but surely the honourable man can't be standing there justifying that level of greed against poverty in the spring of our creativity across this land.
Gentlemen, I attended the Music Industry Trust Awards dinner, which was, probably about 15 years ago now, where they honoured Lucian Grange. And in the course of his being honoured by the industry, I heard from the artists who he had spotted and signed up. In particular, I remember Take That. And Take That came and said the only reason that they were as successful as they became was due to the support that they received from Lucian Grange. So yes, he doesn't necessarily play an instrument. I think he does in a not particularly professional way. I may be doing him an injustice, but he is an extraordinary talent in the industry in that he does what labels are there to do. He goes out and he finds talent, he invests in talent, he builds them up, and he makes them into the global stars which we now celebrate in this country. Yes, I could win.
Very grateful for the member for giving way, honourable member for giving way. I have no doubt whatsoever that Lucian Grange is an extremely talented executive in terms of the music industry. But would Lucian Grange be able to be anywhere near as successful if we didn't have many of the artists out there now who are living on poverty wages, locked down in their houses for almost 2 years, unable to make any money through live gigs, and getting nothing, barely anything, from streaming revenue?
Of course, we depend upon the talent in this country, and some of our most globally successful artists come from the UK. People like Adele and Ed Sheeran, and I have to say they do extremely well. And part of my criticism of some of the measures which are being proposed by the honourable gentleman is that in some areas, they will result in the artists who get streamed most doing a bit better. But the artists who don't get that many streams won't actually get very much more money. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman opposite, 1 million streams sounds an awful lot, but actually, in comparison to CD sales, for instance, it isn't very much in terms of the revenue that 1 million streams generates from the DSPs, the digital service providers, to the rights holders. It isn't actually that much. But I do want to come on to that in greater detail, and also in response to the honourable gentleman, because he's absolutely right that, in a sense, what kept the industry going whilst the revenues were declining from legal sales or downloads was live. And live became another major source of revenue for many bands, and still is. There are bands who actually don't receive very many music streams, but do very well out of live performances because they've got a loyal fan base which will follow them around. And in terms of the earnings of musicians, it is important to take account of the fact that there are a number of different sources, one of which is live, another of which is, for instance, merchandise sales or sync rights, and then, of course, there is sales of physical product and of streaming. And that is something which is brought out very strongly in the IPO survey of earnings in the creative industries. Yes, I'll give that.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. On that point, the issue of who has written the song is quite important in terms of where the remuneration will go. And it isn't just about who is performing it live or not live. It is who has written the song, which will benefit in many ways the legislation that is here. But for bands that we think of traditionally or performers, we have to look at who has written the actual piece of music, because if it is an original writer and songwriter, then they keep all content, and it's much easier for them to transfer their earnings and what they're gaining from their musical production, as well as those who create original soundtracks for motion pictures. But we have to look at, there is a difference between those that are a collectively packaged item and those that are not.
Completely agree with the Honourable Lady and my old friend, and it is the case that composers are actually at the sort of foundation stone of the industry, and composers who may not even actually necessarily have their works performed live. I had dinner about 3 weeks ago with somebody who's not actually probably been heard of in this chamber, called Terry Devine King, who is a composer, but he writes for television productions, for film productions, for advertisements, and he receives a very good income from doing so. So I absolutely recognise the importance of composers. But for those who do depend on live performance, yes, of course I'll give away from John.
From giving away. Just briefly, I take his point about what he said about Take That, and I don't seek to personalise these issues too strongly, but was he aware that Gary Barlow signed the letter by over 200 artists, which was presented to the Prime Minister in support of my proposals?
Yeah. Very good.
Well, I have to say, I suspect there are quite a lot of artists I enjoy and admire who may have signed the letter to the Prime Minister, but that doesn't mean I necessarily think they're right. Some artists are extremely knowledgeable about the economics of the industry, but it is horribly complicated, as I think everybody who has looked at it or indeed sought to participate in this debate would recognise. But I do want to move on to the measures in the Honourable Gentleman's Bill. Before I do so, as a former DCMS minister, I have to just put on record that I'm proud of the efforts of the government to sustain the industry, particularly when live performance became completely impossible as a result of lockdown. And the fact that the government was able to find £2 billion for the Cultural Recovery Fund and schemes like the Live Events Reinsurance Scheme have kept the industry going. I went recently, one of the things we can celebrate is that live is now back. And for those of us who enjoy music, it is now possible to go and listen again. Last Saturday, I was at the Whittam Public Hall listening to Bootleg Blondie, which I thoroughly recommend to anybody who is of my generation and who remembers with great affection Debbie Harry, who is still performing, I think, today and is about to go on tour. But I also went to the Chelmsford Hot Box in the constituency of my honourable friend Chelmsford, and listened to two live bands, one a Scottish rock band with a sitar player called Helicon, and a second, which is a Mexican rock band. But the owners of that venue said to me that they could not possibly still be in operation if it hadn't been for the Cultural Recovery Fund. So, I just want to take this opportunity to point out that the government did keep that industry going. But of course, the thing which has now been the saviour of the industry, which has reversed Lucian Grange's dire prediction, is streaming. And where I disagree with the Honourable Gentleman is that he said that streaming was taking over from radio. It isn't. Radio is actually doing pretty well at the moment. There is very little evidence that radio is in decline. I was talking to Global about that in the last 24 hours. Where streaming is taking over is it's taking over from physical product or downloading. And if you look at the revenue from sales of CDs or from downloading, it is in steady decline, and people are now relying more and more on streaming. The other thing to point out is that he talked about the way in which radio distributes money to performers and artists and composers particularly. That is done through PPL. It's worth noting that in America, if you get played on the radio, you don't get any money at all. So there is a specific way which is different in the way that music is distributed as a result of radio plays in this country to the way in which it is from streaming. But I mean, if you look in some other countries, there isn't any money at all. As I said, the revenue to musicians comes from a large number of different sources, and streaming is only one. But it is noteworthy that in the last few years, the share of the amount of money from streaming that goes to artists has actually gone up. Streaming has increased steadily, but between 2016 and 2019, and these are figures which come from the IPO Survey of Creative Industries earnings, the artist's remuneration in the course of that last few years has gone up by 46%, whereas the revenue to the labels has only gone up by 31%. So artists are actually taking a bigger share of the revenue from streaming services than they were previously. And that is borne out by the IPO survey. And I would just also question what the Honourable Gentleman said about the failure of the industry to engage with the IPO, which is not the case. And I think if he looks at the final report, it does recognise that after an initial disagreement about the scope of the survey in one or two points, the industry did provide a lot of data. So I do think that there is an improvement taking place. That's not to say it could not go further, and I will come on to say that I do have some sympathy with one or two of the points that the Honourable Gentleman raises, but it is not as if artists suddenly are being deprived of revenue as a result of the move to streaming. So I want to comment specifically on some of the proposals that the Honourable Gentleman has come forward with, particularly that of equitable remuneration. Now, equitable remuneration is in the eye of the beholder. Who decides what is an equitable remuneration? Now, one of the answers that the Honourable Gentleman has put forward is the Copyright Tribunal. Now, actually, there isn't a system of equitable remuneration in Spain. It doesn't actually take the money away from the rights holders to give to the artists. It actually takes it away from the platforms. And there is an argument, which I will come on to, that actually the platforms are the people who are getting an unjustified high proportion of the revenue and keeping it. So the Spanish have a system there, but something like 23% of it goes in administrative costs. But what I think is the principal problem is that the idea that labels are making huge profits at the expense of artists ignores what labels do. I'll go back again to the early days, before the Honourable Gentleman sort of talked about in the industry. Another of the campaigns, which I remember very well, which was actually mounted by the DCMS Select Committee before I chaired it. It was under the chair of the then member for Manchester Gorton, Gerald Kaufman, who pointed out that CDs cost, I don't know, twopence halfpenny to actually produce in a press. If you made millions of CDs, cost virtually nothing, and yet they were being sold for vast amounts of money, £10 or something or more. What that ignored, and the same applies for streaming today, is that the labels were supporting a vast number of artists on the basis that they potentially could be tomorrow's Ed Sheeran, or they could be tomorrow's Adele. But in the vast number of cases, they're not, sadly. But the way in which you find the future stars of tomorrow is by backing a huge number of artists in the knowledge that you will find a jewel amongst them. But you can only do that if you invest in a vast number of artists. So when the labels invest in artists, they expect to lose money in most cases. And that's just the way in which the economics of the industry works. So something like 40% of that revenue goes into simply marketing and A&R. A&R, the identification of the artist, the finding of those, and then marketing. People say, well, who needs labels anymore? Because you can just put up your music on Spotify or on YouTube, and you can go out and sort of promote it on social media yourself. You don't need labels anymore. I have to say, I don't think you will find a single successful artist who would agree with that. At the moment, there are 60 million tracks on Spotify. 60,000 tracks are uploaded every day. Amongst those may well be real talent, real stars. But finding them amongst that noise is almost impossible. So where a label comes in is that the A&R people go out, they listen to bands, they listen to performers, they find that unrecognised talent, they sign it, they put the talent together with the session musicians, with the orchestras, with the songwriters, and then they market it. And that requires now negotiation not just with radio stations, but it requires expertise in promoting records on. For instance, one of the biggest places now to promote music is TikTok. And a huge amount of effort goes in to try and elevate on social media. All of that is where the expertise of labels come in. And labels do play a very important function. Now, again, in the course of this debate, the attention has been paid to the major three global labels, which are Universal, Sony and Warner. But actually, 26% of the releases are now done by 26% of the market is held by the small independent sector. And I would have to say to the honourable gentleman that I've spoken to a number of independent labels and they are all really, really concerned about the provisions in his bill. I'm just to give three examples of many. Dirty Hut, Good Soldier, Cherry Red have all come forward and said this will prevent them finding new British artists and investing in them. And the irony is that actually, the way in which the music industry has developed recently is that some of the most popular artists who are now being found and are being signed and their music is beginning to be promoted are the young grime artists from the council estates, very disadvantaged backgrounds. And my fear is that if you take the money away from the labels to give to established, successful artists, you are depriving the future stars of that investment on which they depend. And that is one of the real concerns about the effect of what the honourable gentleman proposes. The next thing I would look at is contract adjustment. And yes, I mean, sometimes contracts do need to be revisited, and that's something labels do a great deal of the time. But again, the interjection of a copyright tribunal is going to create a huge uncertainty. And that is exacerbated, if you like, by the proposal for contract revocation after 20 years. 20 years may sound a long time, it isn't very long. If you are signing and investing in an artist, and an initial investment with tens of millions of pounds, you know, if you have the knowledge that the artist and you and the label have reached a contractual agreement which will extend and allow that money to be recouped over a lengthy period, it does give certainty. If you say that after 20 years, the artist can just say, well, actually, we've decided we're doing really well, and so we want to tear up our contract because we don't think it's fair any longer. That introduces a degree of uncertainty. It's also, I say to my honourable friends, just one second I would just say to my honourable friends on this side, it's in my view a profoundly unconservative thing to do, to set for the government to step in and say to a contract reached between two willing parties, sorry, we're going to completely legally give you the right to tear it up, even though you have committed yourselves to it. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you, my honourable friend, for giving way. On the issue of copyright and content, I agree with both points that all the members are making today, but in the nuanced sense of the issue is that the copyright needs to be able to be adjusted or transferred over to the artist so that online content such as streaming on YouTube, TikTok, and Insta for someone who already has a pre-existing record label can happen, because an artist now in modern day has the ability to create a direct link between content being shared and direct remuneration, which is a separate link from the labels. But oftentimes, if they're already linked into a contract, they cannot actually use that sort of third mechanism. So it would be... Sorry. That is a long intervention.
Yeah,
right?
I think perhaps it might be good to move
boring
to
for Britain,
the
and
question.
I apologise. But I shall finish now. Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in defence of my honourable friend, I mean, it is, as I think she's illustrating, an incredibly complicated area in which there are many different types of contractual agreement between label and artists. And actually, again, I think my the Honourable Gentleman's bill doesn't necessarily reflect the number of different permutations which now exist in terms of those artists who, for instance, want to take a lot of money up front and almost sign away their rights to future income streams from royalty payments because, in some cases, because they are elderly. I don't want to pick out any particular artists, but, ones who are perhaps of a certain age or above, they may not think that, enjoying the revenue from future streaming is going to last them very long, and so they would rather take a substantial advance payment and give over the future royalty payments. My honourable gentleman.
I completely accept that in the vast majority of cases, contract law should stand, and if two people have entered into a contract, then that's their business in a sense, and for nobody else. But we have repeatedly, in lots of other industries, decided that there are occasions when exploitative contracts have been entered into because there's not an equality of arms between both sides. So, for instance, in financial services, we legislated a few years ago to strike down a whole series of mortgages that people had entered into because they weren't entered into on a fair basis. My anxiety is that the world at the moment is really stacked against lots of the artists. We repeatedly seem to want to expect that their music should be free, and that seems unfair.
Whittingdale.
There are a number of points there. I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman recognising that we should be very wary about stepping in to interfere with voluntarily agreed contracts. And yes, maybe if there is evidence of exploitation and abuse of a dominant position, then that is a circumstance. And actually, that's one of the areas where I think the honourable gentleman has done a service in allowing us to look at this issue, and that there does need to be action taken. And I know that my honourable friend on the front bench will, in his response, will talk about what the government is doing to address some of these concerns. But just before I finish, I want to just continue with what the honourable gentleman is proposing. I've talked about revocation of contracts and adjustment. He's also keen for greater transparency. Now, I think the labels are doing quite a lot to release information, make sure their artists fully can see the way in which the economics are working, how they are being remunerated. But the honourable gentleman actually is going further than many of the provisions even advanced by the European Union. And some of the information that he wants is simply not available, and others, the involvement of, for instance, the tribunal in all of these cases would, I think, lead to a huge increase in administrative costs. I would pay tribute to some of the more far-sighted labels who are already addressing some of the concerns, and they're not all doing so. The Select Committee, in their report particularly, talked about the initiative, and it is by Sony. This is not just because my son happens to work for Sony, but Sony have brought forward a programme called Artists Forward, in which they have essentially written off unrecouped balances for artists signed before the year 2000. That's been followed by some of the smaller labels, and the Select Committee rightly paid tribute to them and called upon the other major labels to follow suit. I think that would be a good thing. I do think that even though the labels perhaps are not the villains of the piece that some have suggested, they could do further. They could do more to try and ensure that there is a fair distribution, that their artists do receive more money. And that, in that respect, that is why I think the government's response to the Select Committee report was right, both in terms of saying that we need working parties to bring together the government, the IPO, and the representatives of the industry to look at these issues, and at the same time inviting the CMA to carry out a market study. And therefore, even though I have unhappiness with what the honourable gentleman proposes, even if I didn't, I think I would say, look, it is premature to start legislating when we have that work ongoing and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so it is sensible that we wait for that work, which is taking place now, before we reach any final conclusions. My honourable friend.
I thank him for giving way. On the point of markets, I was reflecting on the comments he made about this being a statutory measure to allow review of contract. Is there a danger that could create a market distortion that would actually diminish the new contracts which are being set up, because the music industry would see in 20 years' time, if the artist is successful, they're going to go to a different provider.
My friend is entirely right. And that is something the labels are very anxious about, that when they reach an agreement with an artist, at the moment, they have written in a legally binding contract a certainty which would be removed if you suddenly give the right to one party to say that after a certain period they can just essentially tear up the contract. And so it would create uncertainty, which is bound to have a disincentive on signing new artists going forward. So I think my honourable friend's absolutely right. Where I do think there is more work to be done, and I hope the CMA market study may bring this out, is actually an area which is not covered in the honourable gentleman's bill, and that is the power of the digital service providers, who are very dominant, and where the industry has been complaining for a long time about what they have termed the value gap, which is the amount of money which is retained by the platforms and is not given over to the industry. And I have to say YouTube are the particular offenders in this. They take advantage of this thing called safe harbour under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And as a result of safe harbour, they are giving over a fraction in terms of the revenue they receive to the rights holders, particularly compared with Spotify, whose record in this area is better. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Surely the greatest distortion in the market is the fact that artists aren't getting paid a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. That's fundamentally about fairness, and this will help break down monopolies as well. One such person is Tim Burgess, who I know has been very supportive of the Honourable Member for Cardiff West. I think you're on his listening party on December the 15th, if I remember right. So tune in. Thank you.
The honourable gentleman, that, as I said earlier in my remarks, I mean, the revenue share going to artists has gone up, hasn't gone down. And I don't think it is as immediately obvious as he says that they are being deprived unfairly of income. This is an incredibly complicated area, as I think everybody will recognise. And I return to the fact that before we reach any conclusions, let's have the CMA carry out a proper market study. Let's have the working groups conduct the discussions. And then we will see whether or not the evidence. But if he goes